Hi, the purpose of this recording is to give you an overview of fluency, which is one of the components of effective reading instruction, and we are also going to talk about some different teaching techniques that you can use for fluency. So fluency is usually thought of as two different but important components. One is automaticity, and automaticity is the rapid and effortless recognition of words. So being able to read a text and know just about every single word that you're encountering quickly just by sight. When a reader is not fluent, when a reader is not reading with automaticity, the reader is spending a lot of time sounding out words and not recognizing words immediately. So prosody is another important component of fluency, and prosody refers to reading with expression. Ideally, when we read aloud, we want our reading to sound like natural speech, like use the same kind of intonations and the same type of phrasing that we would hear when somebody is talking. When a reader isn't reading with prosody, the reading sounds very monotonous and very mechanical and very dull and uninteresting. So these two components are important when we talk about reading fluency. And in the article that you read about fluency for this week in class, the authors talk about how a lot of teachers have just placed this focus on automaticity, getting students to read words faster and faster, but that's really not a complete definition of fluency. We also have to take into account prosody, or reading with expression. And fluency, unfortunately, it's important, but it's sometimes overlooked in classroom instruction. As noted in the article that you're reading this week, it's not really considered a hot topic in the world of reading instruction, but it's still important even though it's not necessarily the most popular topic. So fluency is important because if you think about the working memory, the amount of cognitive space that you have to devote to a particular task like reading, if you're spending a lot of your mental energy on decoding words, sounding out words, and trying to figure out how to say them, that means you have less cognitive space for devoting to comprehension. However, if you are able to recognize words rapidly and read them very quickly, therefore you have more cognitive space available to think about what the words are actually saying to you. So you have more mental energy that you can devote to comprehension. And even though these other components of reading instruction, like phonemic awareness and fluency and phonics instruction, are all really important to reading, comprehension is really one of the end goals of reading instruction. The goal for all our students is to be able to understand what they're reading and to make meaning from what they're reading and to be able to evaluate what they read. So fluency is actually often considered an indicator of comprehension. So, there's not always a direct correlation between the two, but a lot of the time when students are reading with fluency, they're also understanding it. Because if you think about it, if you understand something that you're reading aloud, you're going to be using, proper phrasing, you're going to be using a proper tone and paying attention to punctuation and so forth. And if you're not really understanding it, your reading might sound choppy or mechanical. So oftentimes fluency is thought of as an indicator of comprehension, but not always. There are some exceptions, of course, to every rule. And when we teach students, or when we instruct students in fluency, that instruction should come at the student's instructional reading level, meaning you should be using texts for fluency instruction that students can read with about 90 to 95% accuracy. If you're teaching students teaching fluency instruction using texts that students can read very proficiently on their own, or in other words, texts that are at a student's independent reading level, students already know how to read those texts, so fluency instruction might not be as helpful. But when you're reading, instructing students in fluency at that instructional reading level of 90 to 95% of words being able to be read accurately, then that's really the just right spot for fluency instruction. So fluency is something that's really important for you to model as a teacher, and here I'm going to talk about some ways that we can model fluent reading with students. One important way of modeling fluency is through teacher read-alouds, meaning the teacher takes a book or some other text like a newspaper article and reads it aloud to the students. And that's really important because if we want our students to read fluently, they need to understand what fluent reading sounds like. So it's really important for you as the teacher to model fluent reading. And reading aloud to students also has a number of benefits besides modeling fluency to students. It can also build their vocabulary. It exposes students to different genres. It exposes students to different authors that they may want to learn more about. So reading aloud just has a host of benefits besides fluency, but I just want to make you aware of a few different things. And you shouldn't think of reading aloud as something you only do with primary level students, like students in grades K through 2 or K through 3. Reading aloud is also something that older students can enjoy. Like when I was a 4th grade teacher, as students had their snack time, I took time, 10-15 minutes, to read aloud to the students every day, and they really enjoyed that. And I know that even as an adult, it might sound silly, but I enjoy it when I'm being read to. For example, if, when I was a master's student and I was taking language arts methods, my teacher or professor would often read aloud from children's books to get us more familiar with them. And I just really enjoyed that. I really think that even as an adult, you can really enjoy a read aloud. So don't feel like, reading aloud to your students, even if they're older students, that it's a waste of time. Reading aloud has a lot of benefits and can be enjoyable. So there are also forms of modeling fluency called assistant reading. One form of that is choral reading, where the teacher and the students, whether a small group of students or a whole class of students, is reading the same text aloud at the same time. So as noted in the article that you read about fluency for this week, that helps less confident readers hear what fluent reading sounds like, and it helps them to attempt reading aloud in sort of a low-stakes setting because it's hard to really distinguish an individual voice in a choral reading. With echo reading, the teacher or a more proficient reader will read a text aloud, and then students will repeat the text all together. They'll echo what the teacher is saying. And then another form of assisted reading could be buddy reading and paired reading. And with buddy reading and paired reading, you pair a proficient or a strong reader with a striving reader who is still learning how to become fluent, and the two read the same text together out loud at the same time. And then if the striving reader decides he or she is comfortable with trying to read the text aloud on his or her own, then he or she can just tap the buddy or the older or the other reader on the shoulder and let that reader know that they can stop reading, so the striving reader can try it out on his or her own. And there are also ways of modeling fluent reading using technology. For example, the article talks about how Caption TV is a way for students to hear fluent reading by listening to the television and then looking at the closed captioning at the bottom of the screen. And the authors, Rasinski and Samuels, do note that Caption TV is a really passive way of teaching fluency, but if it's already something that students are doing anyway, you might as well use the closed captioning function and have them learn something about fluency while they're at it. Books on tape or teacher-recorded books are also a way for students to hear models of fluent reading, so students can follow along in their book and they can hear the book being read aloud either on a tape recording or on some kind of technology tool that the teacher has. For example, there is a free, I think it's free, app called Voki that teachers can use to record their voices. So that can go along with a book on, sort of like a book on tape sort of a thing. And there are also several apps that you can use with students. For example, Reading Rainbow, you might remember that as a television series. I know I used to watch that when I was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s. And book apps like Reading Rainbow, when a book is purchased, there are often, you often have a function where the app can actually read the book aloud to the child. So it kind of functions in the same way as a book on tape. It's just a little bit more up to date in terms of technology than the book on tape. I don't even know if people have tapes and cassettes anymore. I haven't seen one in a long time, but All right, so guided repeating reading or guided repeated reading is another way that teachers can instruct students in fluency. And this particular technique involves reading a text multiple times and giving students feedback on their repeated readings. And oftentimes when you engage in guided repeated reading with students, you want to give the students an authentic purpose for doing the repeated reading. If you're just having them reread the same paragraph over and over again for no particular purpose, then it seems to lose its luster and not be as interesting to students. But if students know that the repeated reading is going to be for a real purpose, like performing it in front of an audience of people, then it's more motivating for the students. As an example, there are a number of children's books that are written as poems that could be used for fluency instruction. For example, a Newbery winner from, I think, 2008, Good Masters, Sweet Ladies, Voices from a Medieval Village, every chapter of that book is told from the perspective of a child living in a medieval village, and all the different chapters are interconnected in some way. And they're written as poems. So those would be, those chapters or selections from those chapters would be great for students to practice reading aloud and to practice their fluency, and then those passages that students are practicing could be performed in front of the class or in front of an audience. And I will note that Good Masters, Sweet Ladies would be more for upper elementary or even middle school students. That book would probably be much too difficult for really young learners, but I just wanted to give you an example of a book that could be used in that way. Another book that won the Newbery Medal as well is called Joyful Noise, Poems for Two Voices, and that is a collection of poems that are written from the point of view of different insects like butterflies and water bugs. And what's fun about them is that the poems involve two children reading aloud. So the children read as partners, and sometimes one child will be reading aloud and the other child will then take a turn reading aloud, but sometimes they're actually reading together. So it's a great collection of poems that can certainly be used for students to practice their fluency. And when they're reading things like poetry and they have a real purpose for doing so, like a public performance or a performance in front of the class, then it's much more motivating than simply just assigning a passage for them to reread over and over again. I also wanted to talk to you very briefly about Reader's Theater. And Reader's Theater is basically like the script of a play, except the purpose of Reader's Theater is to give students practice with repeated readings. So students would read their part in the Reader's Theater script over and over again, but you're not really expected to memorize your part in the script, and you also don't need to necessarily dramatize your part in the script. Like, to perform Reader's Theater, you don't really need props and things like that. Basically, the idea behind Reader's Theater is that students are given a part and they're expected to practice reading their part aloud with their classmates over and over again until, they've developed their character and they're able to read with expression and really act out the part of the character. But again, you don't necessarily need props for doing so. So in the article about fluency that you read this week, the authors talk about something called the Fluency Development Lesson, which is an instructional routine that you can use to help students build their fluency. Since you read about it in this week, I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time going over it step by step, but just as a quick overview, usually a fluency development lesson goes something like this. So the students begin the lesson by rereading a passage that's already familiar to them, something they've read before for practice so they can practice their fluency. Then what the teacher does is he or she introduces a new text and reads that to the students aloud multiple times, and the students can follow along. And after the teacher has read the passage several times, the students and the teacher can discuss what the passage is saying, what it's about, and so on. Then that discussion is followed by choral reading of the same text that the teacher read aloud, so the students have an opportunity to read that text all together as a whole class or in a small group. And then what the teacher does is she organizes students into pairs, and the students take the text or the passage that they've read chorally and that the teacher has read aloud in previous steps, and the students take turns practicing reading that passage aloud to each other. And then the students, if they wish, can perform their reading in front of a different audience. For example, they might go home and read the passage in front of family members or in front of pets or neighbors, whoever the children or the child wants to read aloud to. So really with the fluency development lesson, the idea behind it is that students are reading the same text over and over again, and because they're reading the same text, they're building their word recognition. So phrase-cued reading is another method that you read about this past week, and with phrase-cued reading, the teacher and the students have a copy of the same text, and usually the teacher will want to project his or her copy of the text so the whole class can see it, like on an overhead projector or on a smart board, or however else the teacher can share that with the whole class. So what the teacher does with phrase-cued reading is the teacher inserts slashes in the text to show where pauses and change of tone should occur if you're reading it out loud. So as the teacher is doing that in front of the whole class, the students follow along and make slashes on their copy of the text. And then when students have their copy of the text slashed appropriately, as the teacher has modeled, the students have an opportunity to practice reading that text aloud. And certainly the teacher should also model how the reading should sound as he or she is demonstrating where the slashes should go. So the language experience approach is another way that you can teach students fluency, and the idea behind the language experience approach is that students' own words are used to teach reading. The idea is that if students can say it, they're capable of reading it. And this approach works with either individual children, small groups, or the whole class. And in terms of teaching fluency, you can start by talking about an experience that everyone in the group has in common. So for example, maybe the whole class went on a field trip, or maybe you just got a class pet, something that everybody in the group can talk about. So after talking about the experience, the group decides, all right, what are the most important things we want to say about this particular experience? And the students will dictate, and as the students dictate, the teacher writes down what they say, and after the teacher finishes writing down a sentence, he or she will stop and reread the sentence to the students. Now, when the dictation is over and the students and the teacher have constructed a passage or a paragraph about the experience, the teacher will read the text aloud, and then the students will have an opportunity to practice reading the text on their own several times for the purpose of building their reading fluency. So Tea Party is another strategy that you can use for fluency instruction. So with Tea Party, the teacher will make cards, like index cards, with excerpts or short chunks from a particular text. And then students are given cards and they spend some time practicing reading their cards aloud to build their fluency. And again, they need to read the cards multiple times in order to develop their word recognition. And then students move around the classroom and talk with different classmates. They read their excerpts to other students, and then they talk about what the excerpts mean. And then at the end of the tea party, after students have had the opportunity to read their cards multiple times to other classmates, the whole class comes together and they put together what they learned as a result of the tea party. What is it that students learned as a result of reading all these different excerpts on the cards? How do they put it all together? And this is a fairly easy to implement fluency activity that I really liked and I tried in my classroom, and this is called the Great Poetry Race. So with the Great Poetry Race, what you do is you have students select a poem. And when I was a teacher, I gave students like a packet of poems that they could select from. I gave them bounded choice of poems, and students selected the poem that was most appealing to them, and oftentimes they picked a poem that was at, their just right reading level. So I had a span of poems that were, available for striving readers, and I also had some more complex poems in order to meet the needs of my advanced readers. So you want to, have a range of poems available to your students. So what you do is you challenge the students to read their poem to as many different people as possible within a given amount of time. I think that I gave students 2 weeks to do the Great Poetry Race. So students have their copy of the poem and they try to go up to as many people as possible and read the poem as many times as they can. And as students read their poem aloud to different people, those people sign off saying that, yes, the student read aloud the poem to me. And at the end of the Great Poetry Race, at the end of the week or 2-week period that you've set, the student with the most signatures wins the Great Poetry Race. And the idea behind the Great Poetry Race is that the repeated reading of the poem actually builds the students' reading fluency, because they see the same words in the poem over and over again, and they begin to recognize the words in the poem automatically. And I found that this was an activity that all of my students really enjoyed, and actually the year that I did the Great Poetry Race, one of my striving readers, who is several years below grade level, actually won the Great Poetry Race. She was so determined to win the race that she ended up reading to over 100 people. And she was able to read that poem really, really well by the end of the poetry race, and it really made her feel good, which was really important because that was an area, literacy and reading was an area in which she didn't always feel so good. So it was really just a win-win for all the students in my class, but especially for that particular child. So these are some of the sources that I used to put together this presentation. And if you have any additional questions about fluency that this recording or that the reading assignments from this week didn't answer, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.